Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's presentation sponsored by the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading. My name is David Bean. I'm our program chair and vice president. Today's presentation is entitled U.S.-China Competition, and the presentation is also going to discuss the monkey wrench that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has thrown into that relationship. Our presenter today is Richard Fontaine. Richard is the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for a New American Security. He has served as president of the center. He served as president of the center from 2012 to 2019, and as a senior fellow from 2009 to 2012. Prior to joining the center, he was a foreign policy advisor to Senator John McCain and worked at the State Department, the National Security Council, and on the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Richard served as foreign policy advisor to Senator McCain's 2008 presidential campaign, and subsequently as the minority deputy staff director on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Prior to that, he served as associate director for Near Eastern Affairs at the National Security Council from 2003 to 2004. And he also worked on Southeast Asian issues in the Security Council's Asian Affairs Directorate. At the State Department, Richard worked for the Deputy Secretary and in the department's South Asia Bureau. He began his foreign policy career as a staff member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, focusing on the Mideast and South Asia. He also spent a year teaching English in Japan. Richard currently serves as executive director of the Trilateral Commission, on the Defense Policy Board, and as a Sine Institute Fellow at American University. He has been an adjunct professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown's School of Foreign Service. Richard graduated summa cum laude with a BA in International Relations from Tulane. He also holds a master's degree in International Relations from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and he attended Oxford. We are pleased to have Richard join us today. Richard, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me. And thanks to everybody who's joined in. Appreciate it and appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. As advertised, I'll try to spend some time describing a little bit the U.S.-China relationship in its now highly competitive phase, which I think is where we are and where we're going to stay. And then also the implications of the Russia-Ukraine war for their relationship and for U.S. policy toward China, which are, I think, significant in several ways. So just to start out, perhaps, the Biden administration, like its predecessor in the Trump administration, has repeatedly identified China as the United States' most foremost foreign policy challenge. So the Secretary of Defense calls China the Pentagon's top priority. The Secretary of State has described China as the biggest, quote, biggest geopolitical test of the 21st century. President Biden has stated that he envisions, quote, extreme competition between Washington and Beijing stretching into the future. And had we been gathering before the war in Ukraine, all of this probably would have struck many people, and maybe all of you as obvious. Analysts and policymakers across the political spectrum have supported America's shift away from engagement with China in the hopes of transforming China's political system or its foreign policy outlook toward a much more competitive dynamic between the United States and China. And jettisoning the previous strategy of cooperation and integration with Beijing, because again, it was premised on the eventual transformation of Chinese behavior. This has been kind of a rare point of agreement between the Trump and the Biden administrations. I think it's a welcome shift because the previous approach didn't yield the results that were hoped for, or frankly, many positive results in general. China and the United States are in a largely competitive relationship. U.S. policy aims, and I think should aim, to respond to Chinese actions more than to shape those actions in the first place or to change Chinese motivations. And a strategy that's sort of grounded in this reality, one that combines a US-led coalition of like-minded countries together with issue specific efforts to contest Chinese assertiveness and not to exclude potential areas of cooperation where they may exist, that's now emerging to protect U.S. interests and values. And it seems to me that that's all to the good. The background of those responses has been a turn toward hard edge competition, especially following the 2008 global financial crisis. Beijing, after the global financial crisis, detected weakness in the United States, grew very skeptical about continued what it would say is US or Western leadership of the global order, including the global economic order, abandoned its prior strategy of building economic strength while biding its time internationally. And then when Xi Jinping ascended to supreme power in 2012 and 2013, became much more assertive, militarizing the South China Sea, embarking on its Belt and Road Infrastructure Initiative, really more bullying a lot of governments throughout Asia, employing coercive economic tools, and seeking technological advantages, including over the United States. There's a Chinese belief that I think is intrinsic to their outlook today that the West's best days are more or less in the past. China's time has arrived. Its reemergence as superpower, just the world has to kind of accommodate itself, including to the preferences, political and otherwise, that it might carry with that. I said a lot of this would have been obvious before the war in Ukraine, but of course we're meeting after the war has started and while it's ongoing. So, I think it's worth looking a little bit at Putin's war and China's emerging quasi-alliance with Russia and how those are changing China's relations with the United States. So, it's almost hard to think back that, the Olympics and the pre-war era was just not that long ago, on February 4th, just before he was going to invade Ukraine. Vladimir Putin went to the opening ceremonies of the Winter Olympics in Beijing, and he was sitting alone in the stands by himself. And the Ukrainian team entered the stadium, and he appeared to close his eyes as the Ukrainian team entered. And this was sort of picked up by the press, and people wondered if that meant anything. But who knows? But by the end of the month, he would, by force, threaten the country's independent existence and, of course, launch the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But the Olympics and even Ukraine weren't the only item on Mr. Putin's agenda while he was in Beijing. He held a high-profile summit meeting with Xi Jinping. The two leaders pledged friendship and solidarity. And to sum up their vision for what their partnership could achieve, they issued a really expansive joint manifesto. And in that statement, they articulated the kind of world that they sought. And that's a world that would be ordered very differently than in the past. They said China and Russia would cooperate with, quote, no limits to assume their rightful place in a new world order. They would forge, quote, an international relations of a new type. It would be multipolar. It would no longer be dominated by the United States. There would be no further NATO enlargement. There would be no so-called color revolutions, no globe-spanning U.S. missile defense system, no nuclear weapons, no American nuclear weapons deployed abroad. Actors that they say represent just a minority on the international scale, that's us and our allies. They might continue to interfere in other states and, confront countries and try to incite differences. But Moscow and Beijing would team up together to resist them. And in this world to come, no one would any longer pressure Russia or China on human rights. They wouldn't interfere in their internal affairs. And democracy itself would be redefined. It would be subject to no universal standard. This manifesto said it's only up to the people of the country to decide whether their state is a democratic one. Russia would join China to oppose any form of independence for Taiwan, the formation of alliances opposed to Beijing and Asia, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And it's worth reflecting on that because the manifesto puts in stark and in global terms a lot of what Vladimir Putin has pursued for well over a decade. The Russian president has wanted to prevent Ukraine from aligning with the West, to dominate and even absorb the Ukrainian people, to fracture Western unity, especially within NATO, to stop the alliance's expansion, to reverse its Eastern military deployments, and so on and so on and so on. And after a long period of what Russia sees as post-Cold War decline and humiliation, the notion has been to make Russia strong and respected again, a great power treated as such. And for China, Russia would be a strong, close, capable quasi-ally. I say quasi-ally because they don't have a mutual defense agreement. It is not the case that if Russia were attacked, China would defend it or vice versa. But short of that, they have this pledge to work ever more closely in all of these different areas. Well, things haven't quite gone according to plan, I think, to say the least. And in fact, China could be forgiven a bit of buyer's remorse regarding its new quasi-ally, for the very reason that Putin's war of conquest leaves Beijing badly exposed. Many of its businesses are quickly being forced to choose between access to the US market or access to Russia now that the sanctions are in place. Powerful countries that represent well over half of the world's economic output have come together to oppose Moscow's aggression. And China has aligned itself with a country that's showing itself to be reckless, that faces long-term isolation and impoverishment, even as its vaunted military flounders in the field. And that prospect is leading countries in Europe to rethink their security requirements, but also countries in Asia. And we can talk a little bit about that if you're interested. And then, of course, this was not helped by reports that Beijing knew the war was coming. It did nothing to avert it. It merely asked Moscow to delay until after the Olympics were done to begin. That kind of compounds its problems, particularly in Europe, which has been somewhat on the fence in terms of its China policy and how closely aligned that would be with the United States or how independent that might be. But through it all, to this moment, China remains solidly behind Russia, and it will remain so precisely because they have this shared sense that the world order doesn't reflect accurately the distribution of power as it is, and Russia and China's rightful places in that order, and they therefore would like to continue to work together to change that. But there are costs for those positions and for Russia's war, not just in Europe, but also in Asia. So, for example, Japan joined the sanctions on Russia, has been sending equipment to Ukraine. And this may just be the beginning for a country that sees in the Russian invasion a possible antecedent and set of responses to a Chinese attack on Taiwan. Former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who still leads the ruling party's largest faction, he went further a couple of weeks ago, despite Japan's strong opposition to nuclear weapons. He said that holding discussions about them shouldn't be considered a taboo. Prime Minister Kishida kind of quickly rebuffed the notion of Japan acquiring nuclear weapons. But Russian aggression is changing the debate. And these kind of reverberations from the Russian invasion of Ukraine matter, and they matter in the US-China relationship because the fate of that relationship, the fate of the US-China relationship has profound global implications. This is not just confined to Asia or to the Western Pacific or even to the two countries involved. And so the objective of US policy, at least in my view, needs to flow from the kind of order that the United States wants to see obtain in the world, and take into account the kind of threats that China poses to that. And those have become increasingly stark on both sides. Again, the United States generally seeks a global order that's governed by rules rather than brute power, one where countries can enjoy sovereignty, disputes are resolved peacefully, markets are open to trade, human rights are considered universal, democracy can flourish. And of course, our own track record in upholding such principles is hardly perfect, but we've championed those kinds of ideals for many decades now, and still hold that they should govern international behavior. Since the 1940s, the United States has opposed hostile spheres of influence in Eurasia, precisely because they threaten this desired rules-based order. The overall goal of US policy toward China flows from a bigger goal, which is to try to preserve these core pillars of international order. And this stuff gets kind of abstract, but it's real, even as the specific rules and institutions change and adapt. So what we see today, of course, in Europe is Russia transgressing the most fundamental of those rules, which is the independence and territorial integrity of borders in sovereign countries, and essentially a war of conquest there. In Asia, we see that with China's growing military and technological power, its assertive behavior, its economic interdependence with the United States and with its allies, and the incompatibility of some of its actions with the existing order, that we have tensions there too, simultaneously with what's going on in Europe and Russia. And so really, we have an aim, I think, of US policy toward China, which is to ensure that Beijing is either unwilling or unable to overturn the regional and global orders, precisely at the same time when the United States is actively trying to resist Russia's attempts to change at a minimum, the European security order. And if you listen to Russians, the maximum, which is that they say they would like, with this war in Ukraine, to kill the notion of a Western and US dominated global order. Again, all this kind of gets abstract, but it's different in terms of an objective of China policy that one could imagine. So for example, previously Washington aimed, at least in some quarters, to transform China into a more liberal party, a more liberal power, a responsible stakeholder in the international system. That I think is kind of out the window. You could presumably work toward a Cold War style containment approach to Beijing that seeks to stop geographic expansion or even regime change in Beijing. Those aren't on the table. So US policy doesn't aim to stop China's rise per se, but rather to oppose Beijing's efforts to disrupt existing international arrangements in ways that damage the United States and its partners and these kind of ideals that I mentioned. That does not, of course, exclude the possibility of cooperation with China in areas where we have mutual interests. The problem has been that despite the theoretical existence, or I guess even the actual existence of those areas, there has been very little cooperation over the past couple of years. I mean, the pandemic is case in point. This is like almost like the meteor headed for the Earth. I mean, neither the United States nor China have had any interest in COVID spreading. We've had lots of interest in containing it and responding effectively to it. As long as it remains anywhere, it's a threat to everyone. And yet, not only has there been no cooperation on the global pandemic, it's become just another vector of competition between the two countries. Climate change, one often hears, is a source of potential cooperation between the United States and China. Again, neither of us have an interest in the climate continuing to warm and the disruptive effects that would have. And yet you really don't see any meaningful cooperation on climate change. Non-proliferation would be another one, maybe North Korea. But really the relationship today is characterized much more by competition than by cooperation. And despite the existence of areas where we can and should, I think, cooperate, I think the reality is it's going to be quite difficult to do so. What I would maybe kind of close with here is a lot of people have reflected recently about whether this all constitutes a new Cold War. Are we in a new Cold War with China, the way we were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union? And I don't think that it's a replay of the Cold War. I think instead you're seeing a new kind of competition that is emerging. It really eludes neat concepts like containment and engagement that defined America's previous approach to great power politics, nor can you kind of take Cold War, cookie cutter Cold War policies like building a counter-China military alliance or a geographic containment strategy or all-out economic warfare. You can't just sort of transpose those into the US-China relationship and expect those to succeed. And so we have something that is more complicated. It's a much more differentiated competition with Beijing. It's one where that rivalry plays out issue by issue. where countries balance an array of relationships with both the United States and with China, where you don't really see unified blocks or uncoupled economies or standoffs like in the Fulda Gap in Europe during the Cold War. What you do see is multiple strategies that are aimed on both sides at decreasing interdependence in sensitive areas, particularly economic areas, competing effectively where necessary, and trying to kind of conserve energy and resources where they're not necessary. But, and this is the new reality that we're in, the United States is going to do all this while waging something that quickly is looking like a renewed Cold War, not with China, but with Russia, not in Asia, but in Europe. And of course, doing all of that simultaneously is no easy task, even for the richest and most powerful country in the world. But that is, I think, some of the reality that we are in today. So I'll stop here, and if there are questions or comments or anything, I would be happy to take anything.
Thanks, Richard. I have some questions. I see Bill has his hand raised. Bill, just mention in the chat what your intentions are, and we'll either route your question or get you on to ask it. But first, let's get some announcements from our president of the World Affairs Council, Dr. Solomon Lausch.
Hey, thank you, Mike, and thank you, Richard. I think we are going to have a lot more questions for you, Richard, as we move along here. But to pause for a moment to remind people of our upcoming programs, and then one new one. May 5, we have the panel discussion with U.S. Representatives Houlihan and Musser. You can register for that, but registration ends April 25 at 4 p.m. We have a large number of students coming. We have some good corporate sponsorship for the students. But if you're interested in this, we would urge you to get registered. The registration will cut off and end at 4 p.m. on April 25. I think it's going to be a good exercise in democracy compared to, in counterpoint to what we see in some parts of the world today, and have always seen. It'll be an exercise for us in American democracy with two people from two different political parties expressing points of view on foreign policy. And I think we'll see a lot more commonality than we might see conflict. May 11, we have James Garrett, a young man who has traveled to Qatar through the auspices of Qatar and the World Affairs Council of America. He'll be reporting on his impressions about that. He's about to graduate from Penn State University, and he'll be a different kind of presenter for us, a young man, a student who will give his perspective on the Middle East. We have Diversity in Israel with Gadir Kamal Marish, June 1, and looking very much forward to her. She'll have a particular perspective from being a member of the minority community within Israel, speaking on that very point of diversity. The newly created Space Force is our topic with Benjamin R. Ogden, Colonel of the U.S. Army, on June 8. It's an agency that's now in parallel with our Army and the Air Force, the Marines, the Navy, of course, and we will, I think we'll be educated. We don't know a lot about it. He's going to enlighten us. Then finally, our last presentation in June will be with Dr. Sirian Postanzi. She's coming to us from Germany. She is a scholar there now, and she's going to be talking to us about the impact or the way in which the German community, Germany has integrated refugees over the past 5 years, in particular into the education system. That presentation, incidentally, is underwritten in this case, because we do not ourselves provide stipends of any kind, by the German American Institute in Tübingen in Germany. So those are our upcomings, and we encourage you to continue to be interested. Okay.
And we're expecting a pretty good turnout to that live event on May 5th. There are some tickets available. We have over 100 people registered already, so definitely head over to the WAC website, wacwriting.org. You see a button right on the top of the homepage to buy your tickets. Definitely want people to come out and attend that. So we do have some questions coming in. I can see that Bill still has his hand raised. Should we just roll the dice and see if he wants to ask a question? Bill, are you there, Bill? You have a question? Looks like you're muted. Now's your chance. All right, we'll come back to you. Put that in the chat if you want to get your question in. Richard, you talked a lot about the relationship between Russia and China and the West the U.S. specifically. How do the oil-producing countries in the companies in the Middle East come into play? If you look at like Iran, who never really was an ally of the West, Saudi Arabia, who talked about selling oil in exchange for yen instead of the U.S. dollar. What are some of the dynamics there that are coming into play?
Well, the most immediate dynamic is the desire by the Biden administration to increase the supply of oil into the markets in the short run. And given the interruption in supplies that the war in Ukraine has had, and that depending on who is doing the analysis may have taken as much as 2 million barrels off the market. And so, as you all know, I filled up I filled up yesterday and had a little sticker shock when I was putting the gas into the car, and that's everybody's experience right now. And so the administration has tried to do a few things. One, they've approached the Gulf Arab allies and encouraged them to increase production. The Saudis, we've got a complicated relationship with Saudi Arabia. The administration has a complicated relationship with Saudi Arabia. They've declined so far to do this. The administration would like to get back into the Iran nuclear deal, thereby lift the sanctions and increase the amount of Iranian oil that's going onto the world market. That has itself been hung up by the Iranian insistence that the United States take the Quds Force, the paramilitary element of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, off the terrorism list, which it was not on when it went in, but it was listed during the Trump administration. I don't think that's going to happen. And so that's kind of caught up. And then you have Venezuela, where the administration has tried to, at least they sent some diplomats down there to see if a thaw might be in order, again, to try to at least demonstrate that they're trying to do something about oil production. And of course, the president has announced the release of 1 million barrels a day from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And so all of this is varying forms of effort to increase the supply of oil in the global market and bring the price down, including for gasoline in the United States over the short run, even while the same administration would like to get away from fossil fuels over the long run. And that's kind of pushed by the war in Ukraine. That said, America, of course, is not alone in feeling the energy reverberations of this. It's all over the world. I was in the Philippines a couple of weeks ago, and it's not a particularly wealthy country. And the spike in the price of energy, and also, of course, the spike in the price of food has really rattled people down there. And so, all throughout Asia, it's a similar kind of story. So, there's no kind of immediate solution to that, but that's some of the dynamics with respect to the oil producing company. I said the same thing as you. Oil producing countries.
Easy to do, right?
Yeah.
A couple of questions not about Ukraine and Russia, but one more from Randy Newnham, local professor at Penn State Berks, asks, we'll just to stick to the topic for a moment longer, how can we get China to play a useful role in ending the Ukraine crisis? Is there a good cop, bad cop play against Putin here?
No, unfortunately, I don't think so. I don't think China is going to play a useful role. Before the war, the administration in late September of last year started to pick up the intelligence that Putin was planning an invasion of Ukraine. Sent in November Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, who used to be U.S. ambassador to Moscow, to Russia to talk to Putin and try to explain to him what some of the poor consequences of a decision like that might be. That was not successful. And then they approached the Chinese and said, essentially, hey, you guys have good ties with the Russians. They're about to embark, or at least they seem like they're about to embark on a particularly catastrophic set of activities here. Maybe you guys can talk to them, laid out some of the facts and the intelligence. The US subsequently picked up the Chinese not doing that, but instead telling the Russians, yeah, the Americans are trying to get us to stop your going forward in Ukraine, but we're not following what they say. Since the invasion, there's a little daylight between the Russians and the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese abstained at the UN on some of the votes and things like that, rather than voting with Russia. But they really support the Russian position. I mean, as recently as earlier today, Chinese media was putting out stories about how the war was instigated by the United States. And I was on a call with some senior Chinese folks outside of government this morning. And, it was basically Russia has legitimate security interests. This was all fomented by the, untrammeled expansion of NATO to the east. Russia had to defend itself, et cetera, et cetera. So China has not only declined any kind of a mediation role both before and after the war. It's not seen by anybody as a kind of neutral arbiter here or having a place where it could mediate, because it seems to neither want to restrain the Russians in any way nor be kind of an honest broker. And so you kind of look around, well, what's the trade space that China might be able to work in? And it's very difficult to see.
So if we start to move away from Russia a little bit, we'll have kind of a transition question, right? So China has said Taiwan is not the same as Ukraine. Taiwan has always belonged to us. Has been their official position, resisting those kinds of comparisons. Is there pressure on China because of this specifically to deal with Taiwan differently? And then Saul just asked if you could speak directly to the current relationship between Taiwan and China.
Sure. Well, of course, the Chinese say that Taiwan is part of China, has always been part of China. Of course, Taiwan has never been under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, even though both sides have formally, as a diplomatic matter, said that there's one China, and the United States has acknowledged that fact for many decades. I think there's some similarities and there's some differences. I mean, in terms of the similarities, I think both Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping seem to believe that the Ukrainians and the Taiwanese, respectively, are really more or less the same as the Russian people and the Chinese people, even though people in Taiwan and people in Ukraine would differ with that conclusion. That doesn't seem to be a material factor in their assessment. But even more than that, I think they're both sort of personally bound up in the reunification, as they would see it, of Russia and Ukraine and China and Taiwan as a personal legacy project. When Putin spoke to Ambassador Burns, reportedly, he said something along the lines of, I'm running out of time. Ukraine is drifting away from Russia toward the Western orbit. Russia has had leaders that were unwilling or unable to do what's necessary to bring them back in before me. I don't know how much longer I'm gonna, be in charge. I gotta act now. I have no choice. And but Xi Jinping he'll be anointed for the unprecedented since Mao third term here in the fall, and he wants peaceful reunification with Taiwan. He knows he can't have it. So do you give up the reunification or do you give up the peaceful part of that? One guy knows, he's not telling, but one could imagine him feeling more or less the same about Taiwan, in the sense that he's going to be the Chinese leader that finally brings Taiwan back into the fold and doesn't ever let it sort of stray, in a way kind of akin to what they've done in Hong Kong. But of course, there's a lot of differences. And among the differences is the United States made clear, 100 different ways before the war, since the war started in Ukraine, that the United States would not fight Russians in Ukraine, would not defend Ukraine. We would do everything but defend Ukraine. We'd provide arms, we'd sanctions, we wouldn't defend Ukraine. And we might defend Taiwan. And I think the chances that the United States would actively defend Taiwan at the risk of, war with China are relatively high, higher than 50%. I mean, they were 0 in Ukraine. And so, Putin could envision that he was going to fight Ukrainians, however well armed they may be with other things, however well advised they may be from other people, but he's only going to fight Ukrainians. Xi Jinping, if he, somehow got in a war with Taiwan, tried to take it by force, could not be sure that he would only be fighting Taiwanese, as opposed to the world's most powerful military as well. And of course, then you have geographic differences. If we're, God forbid, thinking about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, 90 miles of ocean between the two is not the same as contiguous borders and things like that. So There's some differences, there's some similarities, but I think, this overarching desire on Xi Jinping's part to see the reunification of Taiwan with the mainland is real. And the question is ultimately, if you can't have peaceful reunification, as I was saying, do you give up on the peaceful or you give up on the reunification?
So to that possibility of direct U.S. involvement with Taiwan against China, is that just kind of a standing possibility? Do you have some catalyst in mind, like that changes over time, or that's just kind of a perpetual option?
It's a perpetual option because there's no mutual defense agreement with Taiwan. We have the policy of strategic ambiguity, deliberate ambiguity about whether the United States would come to the defense of Taiwan in a military contingency. So it is unlike our 5 treaty allies in Asia, Japan, Australia, South Korea, Thailand, Philippines. If those are attacked, it is considered an attack on the United States, and we have an obligation to come to their defense under the terms of those treaties. We do not have that with Taiwan. Obviously, we don't have that with Ukraine. We do have it with NATO, with the NATO countries, including Poland. Hence, if Ukraine is attacked, we don't defend, and if Poland's attacked, we do defend. Taiwan has been in the middle, and I think the answer to whether the United States would defend Taiwan actively depends. What does it depend on? Well, it depends on the scenario. I mean, if, for example, at some point you had a Taiwanese government that openly declared independence, despite both the Americans and the Chinese saying, don't do this, and that elicited a Chinese attack, I think that's very different than the Chinese leadership sort of getting tired of having Taiwan be in the current status quo and having an unprovoked attack. It also depends on who the president is. I can imagine that President George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and Mr. or Ms. X, who comes next, all having different views on the risks and obligations associated with defending Taiwan. So ultimately, it would be up to the president of the United States in the moment to decide what to do.
I know last year, I guess there had been renewed reports of crackdowns by China on Taiwan. How would you describe the current state of the relationship? Critical but steady, unstable? What's happening right now?
Well, it's stable in the sense that the status quo of Taiwanese sort of de facto, but not de jure independence and all of that could endure indefinitely. The real pressure point here is Chinese tolerance for the status quo ebbing to such a degree that they wish to overturn the status quo in favor of something else, even if that requires force to do it. Some of that is unclear, but for example, as you're saying, I mean, the pressure has only increased on Taiwan, particularly under the current government. If you had a KMT government, which is not going to be in the offing anytime soon, that was more mainland friendly, maybe you would get a different outcome from the mainland as you did before under President Ma in Taiwan. But under the current government, you've had pressure on the military front with incursions across the midpoint of the Taiwan Strait, with exercises around Taiwan. The effort to go after the remaining few countries that recognize Taiwan diplomatically and sort of offer them economic assistance packages to change their affiliation or change their recognition to Beijing. Of course, cyber attacks and things like that. So, every day there is pressure from Beijing on Taiwan. And the Chinese would say, well, some of that is in response to the fact that Taiwan, that countries in the region are seeing Taiwan increasingly as kind of their business rather than just China's business. There's been joint military exercises the United States has been involved in, around Taiwan, which China has responded. So there's a bit of a dynamic back and forth. But I guess it's stable, but it's under pressure, I guess is how I would characterize it.
Thanks. Russia invading Ukraine is not the only global crisis we have going on even right now. So I know China has massive lockdowns ongoing. How is their zero COVID policy going?
Not well. I mean, depends on what you hold as your metric of success. If your metric of success is zero COVID, to show that the government is the only one or one of the very few in the world that can successfully keep COVID out, which seems to be the top priority, okay, it's arguably successful. But the social and economic costs of that are profound. Currently, Shanghai and other places are under lockdown. The number of people currently under lockdown in China is greater than the entire population of the United States. It's about 350 million people. It's a lot of people. It's in the most economically productive portion of China. So you're going to start soon seeing supply chain interruptions and things because parts aren't being made, because things aren't being shipped and so forth. And of course, it's going to be a blow to their economy. I think what the Chinese really want to do is get to this party Congress in the fall looking like what they keep saying is they want domestic and international stability. They want to show that there is a stable, harmonious domestic situation and a stable international situation so that Xi Jinping can sort of have his coronation to a third term, effectively president for life, against that backdrop. And I think they've calculated that the zero COVID policy is the way to do that, even if there's a price down the line economically and lower growth or an unemployment or supply chain interruptions, that largely will be felt after that period of time. That may or may not be a correct calculation, but I think that's where they are. And of course, lockdown in China is a little different than lockdown in Virginia, for example, which, I mean, it's when they say lockdown, they do lockdown, and, they had predicted an end to this that has already passed. And so people's families' food supplies and things like that have started running out. And so it's created this, it's not unrest, but certainly popular discontent. And, so I don't think it's been a tremendous success.
So here in the US, it feels like we're kind of coming out of COVID. Everything's reopened. Airlines are doing away with masks. Everyone's back at school. And we're dealing with a lot of supply chain issues and inflationary pressures. So I was going to ask what the supply chain issues and inflationary pressure in China looks like. But if they're still very much under these strict lockdowns, like that may not even be on their radar. Is that just the top priority? There's really nothing else on the radar.
It's on the radar, but it's not
kind of what they're thinking about.
Yeah, it's on the radar, but it's not the top priority. I mean, in a way, every country, including our own, who's gone through COVID, has had to decide where to accept risk and what to prioritize, right? So for a long time, the priority was, minimize the spread of COVID, for example, in the schools. So shut the schools down, everybody does it from home. And then it was, well, shut the schools, open the schools, but everybody wears a mask all the time and things like that. And then over time, as the risk of COVID seems to have lessened because of vaccines and all this other stuff, then we say, well, okay, but there's also a downside to keeping the schools closed. And so there's a downside to wearing masks in schools, et cetera, et cetera. So it's about balancing your priorities. In China, they started with a zero COVID priority. And to this very day, they have a zero COVID priority. Things like social freedom clearly are not going to be a priority there. They're much more comfortable with the regime is much more comfortable with and effective at social control than almost anyone else. And so they don't have to worry about, civil liberties. You can't go to court and sort of sue your way out of this. They're not going to have a federal judge say that everybody on the planes doesn't have to wear masks, as happened in this country. So there are things that just don't obtain. And then on the, but what they are, obviously conscious of is the economic effects of this. And the supply chain interruptions, like you're saying, some of the inflationary effects, but also just the economic growth effects, because economic growth in China is, the lowest before this latest lockdown than it's probably been in 30 years. And this is only going to make that situation worse. But again, it gets back to, if you can't have everything, what do you prioritize? And so they could say, well, we're not going to lock down, and we're going to take the risk that COVID spreads, but we're going to have more economic activity. They've done the opposite. We'll have lower economic activity, and we're going to try to stop COVID in its tracks the way that they've tried to do this before. And that clearly is their top priority. And I think, again, there's a domestic political impulse behind that.
And for our part, as much as we think we have supply chain issues now, it sounds like it's going to get worse.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks. Okay. So, changing topic a little bit. David, two very similar questions. David Carroll asked, how do the Chinese people feel about government surveillance? I'm going to guess not good. But Jeanette, well, and we'll just kind of piggyback these two. Jeanette Winkler asked, how long will the Chinese people accept news which has been filtered by their government? So censorship and surveillance.
Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat difficult to tell precisely how Chinese feel about surveillance because by its very nature, it makes it impossible to do, surveys where people can express their disagreement or whatever with that surveillance. I mean, the surveillance and social control mechanisms in China are profound and pervasive. So the predictions that China would over time, as it became economically more prosperous, grow a middle class that agitated for its political and economic and social rights. It's gone exactly the opposite direction, which is the level of social control and surveillance is far greater today than it was 20 years ago. Part of that is Xi Jinping and the regime. Part of that is technology. And, rather than just empowering the individual against the government, it's also empowered the government against the individual. All of that said, if you're in China and you want to access news or information beyond the so-called Great Firewall, it's not difficult to do. You can just get a VPN and go access it. But the vast majority of people don't want to overcome that hurdle to go read news outside any more than, plenty of people do, but it's still a pretty small fraction of the population. Most people's lives don't turn on their ability to access or not access, or they don't believe they turn on the ability to access or not access unfiltered information. And so while it is pretty easy for that to be done, the Chinese government doesn't make it impossible. It just throws hurdles in front of it. So you have to be energized and interested enough to overcome those hurdles to do it. And a small fraction of the population is, a large fraction of the population isn't. So that's kind of where that stands.
Yeah, and it does still require some both desire and ability to do that. It's a relatively low barrier to entry, but it takes some technical knowledge and
yeah, of course. And as much as some of us spend all our time on computers, I mean, even in the United States, the vast majority of people their number one news source is not online information or even newspapers, it's the television. The same thing is true in Russia today. So people say, how the hell can the Russians possibly believe this war is only in the Donbass and it was to, overcome genocide and the Ukrainians provoked it and it wasn't in Kiev? And how can they believe these crazy narratives? Well, if you consume your news on TV, that is the narrative on TV. You can go online and find a different narrative, but most people, even in our own country, don't do that. And so, most people consume the news sources that are most readily available and that are the most convenient. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it can be done, but you have to want to do it. You have to be wanting to, invest the time, develop the, not extensive expertise to do it, but some expertise, some knowledge about how to do this, and then actually go out and do it. So,
yeah. So more of a statement than a question from Melissa Killian. I guess we'll take it as a topic suggestion. China-U.S. relations in South Asia and the One Belt, One Road initiative. Go.
Yeah, it's funny. So just this morning, I had a 2-hour dialogue. It's amazing what you can do over Zoom with a group in Beijing of foreign policy folks that are not in, but that are close to the government, some retired ambassadors, specifically on South Asia. Where, we kind of walked around the region and talked about the different perspectives that the Americans and the Chinese have on some of these issues. One of the big ones, of course, is Afghanistan, and the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan continues to deteriorate under Taliban rule. And that was even before this huge spike in food prices and in energy prices, which is only going to hammer the economy further in Afghanistan and make one of the poorest countries in the world even poorer in terms of what people can actually buy and afford and things like that. The Chinese are engaging with the Taliban directly. The United States, not really, but trying to find workarounds to provide aid. India is the other big kind of issue there because, the Chinese blame the Indians for the border dispute. The Indians blame the Chinese for the border dispute. I think the Indians are right and the Chinese are not. The United States has sort of squarely aligned itself with India, but the Chinese were, at pains to remind us that, if we don't like the Chinese position on the Russian war in Ukraine, the Indians have, as they would say, almost the same position. So why are you friends with the Indians and not with us over this kind of thing? But, South Asia is increasingly becoming a commons for competition between the United States and China, just as East Asia has been for a long time. So you see this with the China-Pakistan alignment, the situation to some degree in Afghanistan, India, not aligned with the United States or aligned with the West, but certainly more aligned than it has been in the future, and far more skeptical of Chinese intentions than it has been in the past, primarily because of the border dispute. So you see, and then Sri Lanka similar. So you see things changing throughout South Asia as countries are sort of forced to navigate between the United States and China, both of which discern interest in that region.
So we'll start to wind down. Just a couple more questions. This question kind of threw me for a loop when it came in. So I did a little bit of research. Apparently, China has created artificial rain 22 times, has been reported. So Mary Louise Hydock had asked if China has weapons that can control the weather. Or like what's behind this artificial rain and their attempts at influencing weather?
Probably to get it rain when there's a drought. But to my knowledge, they don't have weapons that can control the weather. If they do, I'd love to hear about it, but I have never heard about that. So.
Yeah, I tried to do a little research, and then I saw the cases of artificial rain. So I thought, yeah, maybe there is something there. Okay, so we'll wrap up here. I have one more question for you. I'll give Saul a chance to come in with some final words, but I try to end on something fun. So if you think in the recent past here, is there some fact or piece of trivia that you have about China that you just think is really interesting that you could share with us? Just something that's kind of tickled your fancy recently.
Well, I mean, this is not recent. This gets back on a diplomatic history, and this may reflect more on me than anything else, but this always tickled my fancy because I was talking with, so many of us in this field, run into Henry Kissinger from time to time, and obviously played a very catalytic role in the U.S.-China relationship. And so I will talk to him, here and there. So one time I asked him about the negotiating of the Shanghai Communique when the normalization of China began and all of this in the Nixon administration. And if you're geeky enough to go back and actually look at the Shanghai Communique, it's a remarkable diplomatic document, because most diplomatic documents are, these two leaders or these two governments got together and here's all the things they agree on. And, if they really can't agree on something, they agree on things so abstract as to be inoffensive, world peace or, peaceful outcomes or, human integrity, whatever, right? Shanghai Communique is not like that at all. If you look at that, it basically says China and the United States got together. This is how China sees the world. And it was, the worker is the revolutionary actor in the world. Revolution is the current, it was very communist ideology sort of inspired. And then it was, here's how America sees the world, democracy and blah, 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 all this other stuff. And then they came in and said, all right, and so we disagree on all of that, but here's where we do agree. And basically it was, we don't like and trust the Soviet Union. And so this long, we disagree, and then a little bit of we agree, and that little bit of we agree turned out to be enough to build a relationship on that lasted decades. So I asked Kissinger, I said, well, how did that come about? It was so atypical. And he said, well, actually, we had drafted, a joint communique in Washington, brought us with us to Beijing. And it was one of these kind of, abstract, sort of things. He said, Zhu Enlai took one look at it and goes, this is bullshit. and said, we Chinese, we've got our own reputation to uphold in what was then called the third world and in the communist world, where they're accusing the Soviets not being real communists, the Soviets accusing the Chinese of not being real communists or not being real anti-imperialists and stuff. And if we come along and just sort of, agree on some motherhood and apple pie statement with the Americans, our revolutionary cred is going to go by the wayside. So how do we get out of this? Well, okay, we'll say what we say, you say what you say, and then we'll come together on the only things that's actually the reason we're getting here in the first place, which is that we both are distrustful of the Soviet Union. And I thought, like, that's a pretty, I don't know, that tickled my fancy. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's cool. A classic agree to disagree scenario.
Yeah. So,
it's fun to get the background on a historical event like that too, I bet.
Yeah, it was fun. Yeah, so
awesome.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It's been great to connect with you guys, and maybe I look forward to one day of actually being in Reading with you.
Absolutely, you're welcome anytime. We very much appreciate you joining us today. People hung out with the call for us. We had a bunch of questions come in. Super valuable conversation. And I don't see Saul jumping back in, so I think we're just going to wrap it up. Thanks for joining again today, and we will be back in a couple of weeks. Thanks.
Thanks. Have a great day, everybody.